So I thought we would start by going through kind of a brief review. We hit on some of this last week, but just at least for me personally, sometimes I struggle with some of the like chronological order of how all of these things happen. So we touched on last week how Paul, that we were going to talk this week about how this was a pain, or Paul was talking about a painful visit and how he had to write a tearful letter, and that's what we'll be getting into this week. As a quick reminder, from what we know and some of what we can infer from different writings, Paul's first visit to Corinth was somewhere between AD 50 and 52 from Acts chapter 18. So he goes out there, he helps establish the Corinthian church, so he has a strong relationship with the people of Corinth. Then in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9, and we kind of talked about this too, as far as like how we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there are likely other letters that are referred to throughout the books of Corinthians and Paul's writings that seem to indicate that there's another letter, but we don't have access to those in the Bible today or anything. But it is very likely that there was another letter that was sent prior to 1 Corinthians, just because of what's written in 1 Corinthians. Then we have the book of 1 Corinthians. Then it's likely that there was a second visit to Corinth. It's implied, but not actually in Acts. So again, we don't know that for sure. And then we have kind of this severe letter that's talked about that may be part of 2 Corinthians or it may not be. Then we have 2 Corinthians that we'll be studying through. And then likely there's a third visit to Corinth kind of after the book of 2 Corinthians. But rather than nailing down the specifics of all those, because we don't really have time to go through all that, I just want to point out that this is a church that Paul cares a lot about, right? He has made multiple visits to Corinth. He really wants this church to be successful. And so I think that sets a good framework for what we'll be studying today in chapter 2, because it's kind of Paul working through some of the struggles that we can even apply to our lives as we are a part of a church or work with various churches, because as you all know, churches are made up of people. People have feelings. We don't always act as mature as we should in every situation, whether it's us as individuals or as a whole congregation. And so hopefully we'll be able to glean some things today from the second chapter, looking at how Paul handled some situations to, one, help us understand how to help figure out situations in the future, but also to see that it's okay if we're going through a challenging situation to feel things ourselves, right? Paul feels some things because he has such a close relationship with this group of Christians. It's also okay for us to feel things, frustration, different emotions. So I think that's a good framework for us to keep in mind as we study through the chapter this morning. Let's start, if someone wants to read 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 for me. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. All right, I'll go and give people time to warm up. So we'll be in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. But I decided this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then will be the one making me glad, but the one who is made sorrowful by me? This is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all, that my joy was the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. So we see in these first 4 verses that, and we had kind of touched on this, we ran out of time towards the end of class last week in chapter 1, how, there's some sort of tense feelings going on between the church, at least some of the people at the Church of Corinth and Paul. And what we can glean kind of from what we've read here and what we'll go through the rest of the chapter, at the back half of chapter 1, some of the angst was caused by Paul deciding, for various reasons that he wasn't going to be able to make a stop in Corinth when he had planned to. But also from what we see here, Paul Paul in First Corinthians and probably in other correspondence like I referred to that we don't have access to, had to do some correcting. He had to call out things that weren't working well at the church, that they weren't doing right, and make some corrections. And so I think, we've probably all experienced scenarios or seen scenarios like this in our lives, and it can be difficult. So I wanted us to think together first, just as we're like looking at these first 4 verses. First of all, why do you think Paul is so worried that he's like caused them sorrow? What's making him write these first couple verses here? Yeah.
Well, he did write some pretty tough things to the church in 1 Corinthians, and he knew that anytime that you correct someone, they're not always happy about it right away, but sometimes after they think about it, things kind of settle down. And I think he was saying, I'm going to wait till things settle down a little bit, and I'm not going to come and do this in person, but I'm going to write to you first and give you a chance before I come. Then I can be happy. We can all be happy.
Yeah.
And I think he had that faith that they would.
Right. I think that's a real good summary of some things I wanted to hit on. First of all, I think Paul had like a good bit of self-awareness here, right? And like he knew, here's what I did. I needed to do this. I needed to correct them, but you know how people take these things, and I think that's important for us to understand. First of all, we need to know what's going on if we are doing correction, right? Like we've been talking about Matthew 7 and the sermon series, right, on like judging and things like that, and we have to know what's correct or not, first of all, before we can really be telling other people what's correct. Paul was in a position of authority, so he already had the okay to be able to do that. But we even see here that like Paul, even though he had specific plans, like was cognizant of how he had made them feel, and like was like, okay, I'm going to give, as you mentioned, some time for like things to calm down. So how do we like, I guess, embody that aspect of it, right? So like, let's kind of skip past the correction part for just a second, and if we have ended up needing to correct someone, how are we aware of how they've taken it or how they've reacted to the correction? Yeah.
Well, this is part of the first question and this one too at the same time, I guess. But part of that, when you have to correct a group like that, you want them to know, or you try to make them know that you're doing it because you love them, not because you're being a bully, or you're not really taking pleasure in yelling at them or anything like that. And so, in our situations today, if you feel like you need to say something to somebody because you care about them or the situation, you're not doing it because it makes you feel like a big person, or it's not to inflate your own ego or anything like that. It's because it needs to be done.
Yeah.
And it needs to be done because it's hurting them and hurting somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think that's what was why Paul was so concerned about how they now are feeling about it.
Right. And like you're gonna, one, if you know people well, like he knew these people because he's been out there, you're gonna have a sense of how they might react. And I think like we all, understand to an extent when we get corrected, even if it's from someone that we know loves us, it can still hurt, right? Just because I know Shelby loves me, she doesn't correct me that often. But there are some times, I think the most standard one is if I have food on my face. For some reason, if anyone else tells me, I'm like, okay, I'll get it off. For some reason, if Shelby tells me, like in my head, it just triggers something, and I'm like, I do not want to hear this from you. I'm in the middle of eating. I'll clean it up when I get done, which is a silly thing, right? But like that is how a lot of times we react even to like spiritual correction, because a lot of like I may be embarrassed I have food on my face, right? But that's a pretty quick fix, right? And like hopefully nobody's seen that. But like especially with spiritual things, it's like, whether Paul's specifically talking about some sexual immorality in 1 Corinthians 5 or talking about other things, right? Like a lot of times other people in the congregation know this stuff is going on too. And so there's a mix of like, why didn't we take care of this problem? Or, if it's as a whole congregation, it's like, I think things of a spiritual matter are even more significant and like affect us even more. So like even if we know someone loves us and is doing it from a place of love, it can be hard sometimes to take that. So I think that's a really important thing that we can take out of this first verse or two. It's just that, like, we need to be aware of how people are reacting to our correction and make sure that we are, like, giving them appropriate space, I'll say, right? Because Paul also doesn't say, well, if you're upset with me, I'll just leave you alone and never check back in on you, right? Like, because that's another approach we can take if we have a beef with somebody because we've corrected them or not. We can just step back and say, well, I guess they don't want to talk to me anymore. The things still need to be checked in on. Things still need to get better for Christ's sake, for their sake as well. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind as we study through this. Do you, like, and we don't have exact wording or anything here, but what are some ways that you think Paul might have known that there was something going on here, right? That he knew that there were some problems. How do we know if, like, if we're in this scenario where we correct somebody, you know, generally I feel like you correct somebody and they either say okay and are just kind of quiet because they're like ashamed or embarrassed, or they're like, no, you're wrong, right? They get defensive, or they might make an excuse. They're like 3 things that people might do. So that's how they might respond in the moment. But how do you know if someone has actually, like, listened to what you said when you're doing correcting, if you're trying to do that in love?
By their actions.
Okay, yeah. I mean, a big way is, are their actions changing, right? And I think the first and foremost hope is that they've stopped the behavior that you were correcting them on, or they are working to do that, right? But even, like, subsequently, even if they change the behavior that, you know, you were correcting them on, you can still notice a difference in their actions towards you as a person, right? Like, maybe they're doing all the right things, but they, you know, were talking to you every Sunday, or they, like, used to text you or call you and check on you, and, like, that's not happening, or vice versa. If you were checking on them and you used to get, you know, detailed responses, and now you just get, I'm okay, you know, I'm fine, right? I think that goes to some of what we hit on last week of, like, if we really know people, especially those that are here, you know, that we spend a lot of time with, then we can more appropriately understand, hopefully, what's going on in their head, even if they're not exactly telling us. And then, you know, we kind of see Paul talking about how, you know, he didn't want necessarily to cause them to have sorrow, and he has joy in them doing good as a church, but from affliction and anguish of his heart, he wrote to them through tears, right? And he wanted them to be corrected. And I think that's what, like, John was getting at the start there, is, like, if we find ourselves needing to do correcting, I think that there's a lot of times we need to check our attitude too, right? If it's somebody that we already, like, didn't necessarily get along with, and we're like, oh, well, this will show that I'm better than them, or, like, that they have something going on in their life that makes me feel, you know, better about myself, we've got to be really careful. And I think this is a great example of, like, the spirit we should have, right? Like, I don't know, you know, if you all have kind of started thinking through a specific instance or an example that you can think of, but I know anytime that I've needed to tell somebody that they're doing something wrong, I feel similar feelings to what Paul is calling out here, where you're like, is this worth it? You know, like, is this bad enough that I need to bring it up? Is this, you know, worth all the, like, things that we'll talk about that this might cause, you know? And so I think that is not always 100% the exact feelings that we have to have before we go into it, but I think that's a good gut check of, are you, like, excited to give this correction, or are you a little hesitant because of, you know, you care so much about the person? So I guess, you know, before we move on, just with all of that, does anyone have any thoughts on how we balance, like, knowing when it's appropriate to correct versus making sure, kind of what we already alluded to a bit, we're doing it in the right spirit of correction? Like, how do you, you know when something has surfaced up to the point of you needing to go and confront someone about it, and then subsequently, you know, making sure we're checking ourselves? Any thoughts there outside of what I already said? Yeah.
I think our tendency is, rather than make any kind of correction, is to just let it go, which is not good for the relationship in any way. Sometimes it's a whole lot better to say something and work through it than it builds a stronger relationship than just to let it go and pull back and say, well, it's their problem, not mine.
Yeah. Well, because oftentimes, especially if we're talking about interpersonal relationships, it might not even be, that the person is doing something necessarily sinful, but like just the behavior, right? Like if I don't tell you that, something's going on, then I'm going to sit and let it fester in my heart, and then that's going to cause that relationship to not be good. So I think that's a good thing for us to keep in mind to help motivate us when we might not be able to need to go forward and talk to someone about something. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
You kind of get, sorry, you kind of get a sense here that maybe he's feeling a little guilty and,
Yeah.
he's feeling remorseful that he did it, but he knows that he needed to do it.
Right.
And you want to make sure that he's right with them as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And like sometimes that is still like we kind of talked about making sure I've corrected. I know someone's upset with me. I give them the space, but I need to check back in. I need to make sure that like we're on a good spot or we're headed that way, right? Because if you're not doing that, things might not get better. Do you have your hand?
Yeah, I think also it comes with maturity too. I know in the trades when I was in my 20s and 30s, of course I knew everything then, and I didn't have a problem correcting people. Now that I'm older, I choose to use my words a little more wisely, so it does have the correct results. I think that's what we want too, to have the correct results. You gotta measure that out, and I think that just comes with maturity.
Right. Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree, because I think that affects how, and Paul was in an interesting situation here, because for at least some of this, we know he had to like write a letter to them, whereas we have like different means to communicate. But I think we have to know or hopefully we think through what's going to be most effective, right? Like probably today, in the example you're talking about, a letter is not the best way to get that across. If you're trying to correct somebody, especially if they're doing something wrong on the job that could be dangerous, it's like I need to correct them in the moment and tell them not to do the thing so they don't hurt themselves or someone else. And I think there's also the aspect of, is it me and one other person? Because that is very different than if it's like me and a group of people, or like in Paul's situation, him, who is trying to help early churches, and a whole church of people potentially that need to hear, what he's saying in various contexts. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind as well, is the actual words we're saying, we need to make sure they're based in like not our feelings necessarily, but actual truth from the Bible, if it's spiritual, or like that we've thought through this, but then also kind of the medium in which we communicate is important as well. And even like the time that we do it, right? If somebody is, in the middle of facing the consequences for something that they've done, I mean, there are times where we might still need to be like, let's make sure you understand that you're facing these consequences because of this action, but there's other times where it's like, they probably get it. We know that they get it. This is not the time to come in and say, hey, you did this wrong thing, right? And so we have to use judgment there. And then I also think of, how David was approached about Bathsheba, right? Like sometimes if we know people well enough, we know that like directly coming out and saying you were doing this wrong thing, that might not sink in, but he is told in a way that helps it sink in for him that like, oh, I would be mad if somebody else did this thing. It's like, well, that's you. And so I think again, that all comes back to how well we know people. But that can be challenging, even if I know someone really well. That's a lot to think through and figure out. So I think it takes, like Gary said, maturity, practicing this, right? If I never correct anybody, I'm probably not going to be good at correcting people, but hopefully I'm not so good that I've become callous to these feelings we talked about. So I think it's a complicated equation. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing too, as you're talking through this, it sounds like to correct someone, we need to be correctable ourselves, because sometimes when we correct someone, they may come back with some things that we may have done that led to some of their behavior or what's happened. And of course, people need to know up front that you care. I mean, that you're doing this because you care. It's not because, aha, I caught you in something. And that can take time to show people you care. If someone you hardly know and you go and correct them, it may not come across because they say, well, who are you? You've hardly spoken to me. I don't know who you are. What are you doing correcting my behavior?
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Gary?
Well, just one of our sermons, the plank and the spoon in the eye.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've got to be cautious about a lot of this, and I think that's what makes, the Christian walk hard sometimes, especially when we need to like do outward things towards other people like this, is balancing like what is our spirit inside? Are we like taking care of things? Because all this gets way harder if you are also in a mess in your life, and we all are going to face things. That doesn't mean we're going to be perfect at all times or anything like that. But if your life is just constantly messed up spiritually, it is very hard to appropriately correct other people for all of the things that we mentioned. So I think, like, and we kind of hit on this last week too, like this is the motivation to, even when things are going good, to try to keep things in order, because you never know when something's going to come up for you. You never know when something's going to come up for somebody else. So like it's good to keep things in line. Yeah.
You know, basically, other than maybe the elders, if I don't know you, then you're not going to probably be able to correct me in any way, because I don't know where you're coming from. If you haven't been in my house, if I haven't been in your house, if we haven't been out to eat, if we haven't stood around talking, if I don't know you, or if you don't know me, if I came up to you and just said, here's what you're doing wrong, it's not going to weigh much, because you don't know me. And I, you know, Paul knew them.
Right.
He had been in with them, he had eaten with them, he had socialized with them, he was part of them, but you know, we really get kind of estranged. Now, there's a different situation when the elders have been told to, like, talk to people.
Yeah.
So, you know, they've got some commandments, and we are commanded to listen to the elders. So that's a little different situation, but as far as one-on-one, I don't think we can skip that step.
Right.
Because when you know somebody, if they're in your heart and they come to you and say, Yanni, I think you're doing something wrong, and you know how much they love you, that means something.
Right. Yeah.
But, you know, from some other people, you know, it's like they came up to me and said, hey, you're not doing it right. You know, I might consider it, but I might not.
Right. And like, I think that's where you have to consider some of those other methods or mechanisms if you don't have a great relationship with the person. And that, again, depends on the degree of how quick the correcting needs to happen, right? Like, if it's life endangering, then you probably just have to try anyway. But I think even as we'll look at, you know, through the entirety of this quarter in 2 Corinthians, like Paul even has to kind of establish or reestablish his authority in some of the latter chapters in this book. And like part of this is even if people don't know you directly, which that should hopefully be our first like goal, is that like we are close with people we're correcting. But even if they don't, like if you are, I guess, more known as like a patient and kind person versus somebody who just goes off on people, like Paul at this point had a reputation amongst this region, right? And so that probably helped him as well. And so I think we want to not establish the reputation for the sake of the reputation, but if people know us as kind and patient and loving and they see us correcting, then maybe we can go a little on that if we don't know the person as directly. But I think those are all good thoughts. Let's keep going. I'm going to read verses 5 through 11 in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. But if anyone has caused sorrow, he has caused sorrow not for me, but in some degree, not to say too much, for all of you. Sufficient for such a person is this punishment which is imposed by the majority, so that on the other hand you should rather forgive and comfort him. Otherwise such a person might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Therefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. For to this end I also wrote, so that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. But one whom you forgive anything, I also forgive. For indeed what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, I did so for your sakes in the presence of Christ, so that no advantage would be taken of us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his scheme. So I think here we get into some of like a little bit of the detail. We are not told the exact situation. Some people, as I was studying through this, like theorized that we are talking about 1 Corinthians 5, which is the adulterous relationship that the guy is having with his father's wife. Not a great situation. There are some differences here that some people indicate that, you know, maybe that's not the case, since Paul told them to like remove that situation, and here we're talking about forgiveness. So there's a couple different things there, but I think, you know, we can continue as we think through this. It's less important what the specific action, you know, what the specific wrong thing that needs to be corrected was, and more important as we study through this, kind of the attitude that Paul is talking about for both them and him and the person who has needed the correcting. So I think first of all, Paul in verse 5 where he says, but if anyone has caused sorrow, he has caused sorrow not for me, but in some degree, not to say too much, for all of you. So if we're talking about a situation that's going on at the church of Corinth, I think the first thing that people might be thinking, that verse 5 alludes to is that in this situation or how we handled it, we have upset Paul, right? And so he's kind of clearing that up in that sure, Paul might have felt emotions about the situation as he knows it because he cares about the people, but really it's affecting all of them, right, that are there at that church, right? It's not like Paul wrote a letter for correction or, told them that they need to do something right, and he's sitting there holding a grudge against them for how they behaved. It is, affecting all of them, and he wants the situation to get better. So don't necessarily worry about, how Paul specifically might feel here. And then we get on to a little bit of the situation in the following verses, just about how, different things were handled. Sufficient for such a person is the punishment which was imposed by the majority, so that on the other hand you should rather forgive and comfort him. Otherwise such a person might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. And then the other verses that we read there. So I guess I'll open it up. What do you all think, not specifically was the sin or the thing that needed to be confronted here, but what do you all think happened here kind of at a high level in these verses at the church of Corinth?
Well, it appears that some type of discipline was directed toward the person that was caught in sin, whatever it was, and it was something that was obvious to the whole church.
Yeah.
And so once they had corrected their ways, the church needed to forgive them and say, Paul says, if you've forgiven them, I've forgiven them, and this is over. We need to accept the person back and show love to them so that they don't fall back into temptation.
Yeah.
And encourage them. That's what I get from this.
I think that's a good summary of also kind of what seems to be going on here to me as well. So let's break that down then a little bit. So, as Jesse kind of mentioned, it seems like someone has done something wrong that, either a large portion or the whole church knows about, and they have faced punishment for this. So how does, I guess, ideally, how does this play out if we had something like this go on in the congregation here? I mean, clearly, ideally, the situation wouldn't happen in the first place, but we are going to find ourselves at times where someone needs correcting. So if someone that's a part of this congregation, for the sake of example, we can use me if we need a name, but we can, if I need correcting, how is that supposed to play out? I guess, first of all, if I am not on my own making the changes that I need to. So let's say, again, for the sake of example, that the church as a whole knows I went out and murdered somebody last night. We'll go with a far-fetched example, something that clearly I should not be doing. What are the steps that we take from there? Maybe that was a little too far, but maybe we'll go easier and say, you all see I have food on my face. Shelby is not correct. This is something that needs to be taken care of. So how do we...
So I see the food on your face, and I should approach you and say, hey, you got food on your face. And then if you don't take the food off your face, then a couple of us come to you and say, hey, you got food on your face, take your food off. And then it just kind of escalates from there.
Yeah. So there is a path, that's established for us that we have that's not in 2 Corinthians 2 that we follow for kind of getting people to change their ways when we know that something is going on, that they shouldn't be doing. So we, should try to follow that path of, talking to the person first, trying to get them to change their ways, then going back with a small group. And then ultimately, depending on what happens, at a certain point, we are supposed to step away from that person so that they will kind of miss, the camaraderie and fellowship that they have being part of us, or hopefully they change and we help encourage them. So it seems like in this case, we don't know at what point in that process, or if it was more of a one-on-one, if someone was able to convince this person one-on-one, or if it was something that Paul said to them in a letter or whatever, but this person knew they needed correcting. It seems like they've changed and done the right thing. So if we're in that scenario, and let's say it's a little more serious than I have food on my face, like I have wronged someone at the church, or I've wronged someone in the community, what are some of the things that might make it change? Because it seems obvious, right? Like, oh, this person returned and is doing what they're supposed to. I think at face value, we're all like, yes, we'd be so happy. Like, why would I feel any other feelings? But I think when we think about specific scenarios, it's very easy for us to imagine, and we probably have all been through them before, you know, whether it's at church or not, when someone is corrected, what are some things that can lead us to maybe not feel excited about them being forgiven, feel like being loving towards them? What are some things that might cause that not to play out?
Well, if you had been the person that was wrong, say someone swindled you, you know, financially or goods, or, you know, misrepresented, and you were the one that harmed, they were repentant, maybe they make restitution, but there's still going to be hard feelings. It's going to be hard to let that go because I was wrong. And why can you just be forgiven and go on like nothing happened?
Yeah, I think that's a very good, like, high-level scenario of, like, in some way, I specifically have been wronged by the person who is, like, kind of coming back, doing what they're supposed to at church, who is, like, set on the right path, and you kind of want, I don't know if this is exactly the right way to phrase it, but more justice for them, or you want something else to happen, you know, or they shouldn't be allowed to do this bad. Maybe they wronged you, and next week they turned around and they were like, I realized that was wrong, and I have, you know, repented of that, and I'm going to change my ways. Like, and you're like, well, they did this thing that cost me $100,000 or whatever. Like, what if, you know, what? Why do they get to turn around and like be forgiven of that? And like, hopefully, in that situation, part of that repenting would be some, you know, reparation for that. But I think we can imagine many scenarios, you know, depending on what it is, especially if it's one person against another, that would affect that. What about, you know, if it doesn't? I guess anytime someone does something, especially that's like in public nature, it affects the whole congregation, just like we're seeing here. But let's say it's not directly against someone here. What are some things that might, you know, block us from showing this love, feeling love towards a person? Yeah.
It'd be a real temptation to react like the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son. You know, even though he maybe wasn't directly wronged, I mean, in a sense he was. The family name was tarnished. But, you know, I've been good all along, and here this guy's getting all the attention and just having a hurt attitude, arrogant attitude about that.
Yeah, and I think that highlights two things to me. One is the like attitude of, you know, what you already mentioned of like, I've been doing good all along, you know, like the workers in the vineyard who get paid the same, or, you know, many examples we have in the Bible. I think it's very easy for us to be like, I've been doing this right for years, and this person keeps messing up and is allowed to come back. But I think, like, hopefully what we can do in those situations is also remember we do mess up, and we want that same level of, like, forgiveness and ability to come back, whether we've been a Christian for 50 years or we've been a Christian for a month. We want that. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind that there. And then I think, you know, this made me think of something as you were saying that, Baxter. It's like sometimes, you know, it may not directly affect me, but to the family name, right? Like it could be they did something in the community that kind of embarrasses the church, right? Like it's like they went out and did this thing, and now, you know, we've got an example, you know, it's already hard enough sometimes of like, oh, Christians show hate in this way, or Christians at large do this. And so if we say somebody from the Four Lakes Church of Christ did this thing in the Madison community, and they're all in the news and everything, what are people naturally going to ask all of us about? Is like, don't you go to church with Josh? Like, why did he walk around with food on his face, right? Like, so, you know, we've got to be understand, like, it is okay for us in the moment when that question comes up. We're going to feel feelings, right? But, like, we need to kind of calm down and be okay with it. Yeah.
I think it's kind of like trust. When you have done somebody wrong and now they don't trust you, it's like they have to build that trust back up. Even though you might have corrected them, they're still going to try and see if you made that correction or if you're changing in that good direction. Just like trust, you build that trust back up.
I think that's a really good point that I didn't even have in my notes, that it's good for us to keep in mind here, right? Like when we talk about this forgiveness and love, you know, whether we're talking about somebody else at church or it's your kids or your parents or whoever it may be, that does not always mean like, okay, I trust you with everything again, like I've forgiven you, right? There are situations where we definitely, like, that trust is broken and it may be able to be repaired or it may never be repaired, and that's part of love, is still being kind to the person and doing what you need to, but it might not make sense, you know, if they've repeatedly stolen something from your house, it probably doesn't make sense to continue to let them have a key, right? Like, they really need to build that trust back up, and so, like, the same way with the church, right? If they've done something regularly or even once, like, it might be, oh, you know, we need to take a step back and, you know, verify some things before, you know, we would give them that honesty.
Oh, I was just gonna follow up with what Baxter had mentioned about getting attention. I remember a sister years ago making the comment that she said, sometimes I feel like I should fall away or I should do something just to get seen by the congregation. I mean, the feeling that, well, the people who get attention are the ones that have done something. And, you know, here I am like a faithful member coming all the time. And, you know, I just don't have the relationships I think I should have.
Yeah, I think that's like, I've seen both sides of that equation personally, where someone like comes forward a lot for that reason, and I've seen someone that has come forward a lot come forward and say, I feel like I've done some of that. And like, so it's like a interesting thing of like, is there a threshold for when like I would like, you know, publicly say something in front of the congregation as far as like I've wronged people or different things like that, so that there's attention brought to me, very like this is all, I think, a lot more complex than we might first think as we just read through this. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
But to the issue of trust, sometimes we may prejudge someone. If they've done this, they'll probably do it again.
Yeah.
So we can't have that attitude.
Right.
We be careful with that.
Yeah, I think it's like discerning, you know, if that lack of trust is causing us not to show love at all. You know, we're just shunning the person, we're never talking to them. You know, that's a problem, right? But like there are specific things that we might, you know, do differently for a period of time. So I think we have to be aware and cognizant of all of that. And I feel like that is what helps so much about if we have personal relationships with people already in church. It is much easier for me to know before this issue, here's what things look like. After this issue, you know, there's going to be some time frame of like recovery or change or whatever, but 3 months after this issue, are things close to the way they were before or not? If I don't ever talk to a person, then it's like, if it goes back to the way it was before, I don't talk to them anymore. So I think that's, you know, important. Sarah, did you get that?
Well, just to that also, the other side, the person that had done the wrong and is, their trust is also building and to not be judged again, or to feel that that forgiveness was real and trust in that forgiveness, because they're going to come back sheepishly usually and feel like the spotlight's on them and the people are judging me, and they need to feel that forgiveness or whatever, or that's how we lose people.
Right. Because like I know, you know, it's talked about sometimes as far as like especially at churches that you know strongly encourage people like coming up directly after the sermon and saying, I need to like confess in front of all of you all that I've like done this sin. That can be intimidating for a variety of reasons, but also, you know, for what you're saying of like this puts the spotlight on me, and you're worried, like, especially, and a lot of times it's not appropriate to be like, this is exactly what I did, and this is the account of how I wrong people, and then the natural reaction of all of us sitting there listening to something is like, dude, oh my goodness, like I need to, you know, find out more, and like we have to be very careful about, you know, those types of behaviors. But like I have also experienced it, you know, other churches I've been to as well, where kind of in face, somebody will mention that they did something and everybody goes and hugs them and like, you know, says, oh, we want to be here for you. 3-6 months later, they haven't even done the thing again, but like there are like hushed tones, and there's this thought that like, oh, this is a sin that like people of the Church of Christ don't do this thing. So like, I don't know if I can, to the point about trust or whatever, like, can we ever really trust them again? Because it's like we also delineate like this sin, yeah, I get it. I've done this, so other people will, can fall into that same trap. But this thing, that's off limits. I don't know how they could ever do that. So like in our mind, they're like pushed over here of like, yeah, we want you here at church, but like maybe you're not allowed to do certain things anymore or whatever. And I think we have to be very careful of that. Because we also have to recognize as humans, like, sometimes that's our natural reaction, and so we have to overcome that and show love, yeah.
We're not the judge.
Right.
Right.
If we're judging, we're sinning.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to be very careful about, it kind of goes back to where we started of you have to, like, know the Bible well enough or know what you're talking well enough to be able to confront them, to make those distinctions about, like, are they doing something wrong that they need correction. But I think, like, probably what you're getting at is, like, in the moment, it is not for me to say, this sin is not that big of a deal, versus this sin is a big deal. All sins are transgressions of what God wants us to do, and it is not for us to decide what happens away. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, I know that we've been talking about attention and whatever, so why is it that only people that are doing bad things get correction in churches? Why isn't it people that are doing great jobs getting the attention? Why not praise them or go up to them and say, hey, you're doing a great job?
I think that's
Why doesn't that happen?
I think
Because
that's
some. Because some.
I
But
think
it should happen more, you're right.
Yeah.
I think the hard thing there, and this is just kind of how it seems to play out in life too, is like for people who do a great job keeping things running behind the scenes, they tend to get the least praise because things are going well, right? Like some of you all will be like, hopefully, oh Josh, you taught a good Bible class today because I was up here and you saw me, right? But we have so many people that do so many things behind the scenes to keep this running, like there's effort that goes into this. I prepare in different things, but there are people that put in way more effort than like some of the things it takes to get up in front of the church and do. And I think those are the things where we tend to lack, like giving people praise and attention for that. And then also, I think we mentioned earlier, being receptive to correction. In that same regard, we got to be receptive to praise, right? Like if somebody comes up and says, "Oh, you did this good," I shouldn't go like, "Oh no, it wasn't that big of a deal." Like, and that's all like how we communicate and things like that. So it's not the end of the world if you do say that, but like try to be like, "Oh yeah, I appreciate you for thanking me for that," because if I thank you for something and then you're like, "Oh, don't thank me for that," then you start this cycle. Yeah, Patsy, I think you had something.
Well, I was just going to say back when you were talking about sin, sin separates us from God, no matter, I mean, to them, it's not a big level, it's sin.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's very, like, if we find ourselves separating that, we need to come back to that point and just drill it into our heads. And like, just because it's something that I haven't done or I don't think I would ever struggle with, that doesn't make it more of a deal and make my stuff less of a deal.
I think the acknowledgement of good deeds, there is some blessing when it's not acknowledged by man because God sees that. And sometimes our reward is the recognition of others as opposed to the reward of God knowing that we've done that in a humble spirit and no one saw, but He does.
Okay, and that's a good point too. As far as like, especially in the church, but it's probably a good principle in life, we should not be doing things just for the praise of others. But on the other hand, like it does feel good, if you do get appreciation from others. So I think we have to keep both of those things in mind. Really quickly, since we're already over time, I did want to read, and we might be able to spend some time next week talking about this too. But if we drop down to verses 12 and 13. Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when a door was opened for me in the Lord, I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother, but saying goodbye to them, I went on to Macedonia. And what I wanted to mention really quickly here is that we see that like Paul even kind of passed up on an opportunity that he had and moved on because of some of how he was feeling about situations going on. And I just wanted to mention that really quick, and we can kind of dive in a little bit more just to say, you know, we covered kind of how when we're doing the correcting, we need to be cognizant of how people feel, but also like we need to be aware of how we're feeling about things and how we're processing things and working through different things in our lives. Sometimes that's going to impact how well, you know, we talked about in other classes and sermons, like if you're completely run down or you're completely stressed by something else, it's going to be really hard for you to be full and effective serving God. And so like that doesn't mean never do anything for the next year, but sometimes you've got to take time to process your feelings and like work through that as well. So I wanted to mention that really quick. We'll probably have some time to hit on some of this a little bit more next week, but thanks everybody for a good class.